Working on a mid-tone paper is a really awesome approach when you're working with something super luminous like water. So what I have here is I have a piece of paper that is sort of a medium dark color. I have a choice about whether or not I want to use colored pencils, like a black and white waxy colored pencil, or if maybe I want to use charcoal pencils, a white charcoal pencil and a dark charcoal pencil. I'm not a big smudger, and charcoal tends to be a little smudgier. It might be something maybe you'd want to use for trying to draw clouds in this technique, but in terms of this particular image of water and these very high contrast rocks in the foreground, I'm going to go for something that's a little bit more permanent. And what I've done is I've created, a rectangle that mimics the image. And with my light pencil, because this paper is on the dark side, with my light pencil, I've just kind of gone around and drawn around some of the key shapes. What I've also done over on the left here is to create a gradation. And this gradation is something that you might want to work with. So the gradation will tell you pretty much what tone the paper will be in your range from lightest light to darkest dark. So I highly recommend doing something like this, where you could come in and basically put as much light pigment down as the paper can possibly manage. Like, really go, you want to press rather hard with your drawing tool so that this becomes really, really bright. And you can see as I do that the eyes start to kind of gravitate towards some of these middle luminous areas that are some of my brightest brights in the image itself. Then I like to take my darkest drawing tool and I like to come down to the bottom here and lay in some dark. And again, I'm going to try to put it in, maybe doing a little bit of cross hatching, like really try to saturate this box with the darkest dark. And when I look at this, my eye starts to gravitate towards some of these darker areas. So in between is where we start to nudge it towards the midpoint. Because with this technique, the thing is that you don't actually have to color everything in. Like, you can let the paper be something. So I'm going to go ahead and just bring in a bit of white, not too much, just a little bit. And then I'm going to bring in a little bit of black gradually. And I'm noticing that my paper tone is pretty much going to be my mid-value. So that this is my guide, this is my playground. I'm gonna have some things in this image that are actually this paper, where there isn't any white or black pigment put down. So this is where the fun starts. I'm gonna come in and start to work with laying in some of my polarities of light and dark. So I have my white, and I tend to go for the white because I find it exciting, because it sort of feels like you have light shooting out of your pencil. So I see in my image that some of my brightest areas are back towards the horizon and then down through the middle. So I'm gonna just come in and start to lay in some bright pigment. And I'm thinking about how light I was able to get that square. And so I'm just gonna push it till it's quite bright. I'm gonna bring it down around this distant rock. And then I'm gonna let it feather and fade out towards the left and the right, because what's happening in the image, so I'm putting less pressure in my pencil, and I'm allowing the paper to start to take over. I'm gonna keep bringing this really bright down through the middle. Comes down around these foreground or mid-ground rocks, really. And as I'm doing this, again, I'm letting it feather a little bit towards the edge. There are some sort of sudsy kind of wave lines over here, so it's a little brighter. And I'm reserving the paper for now, for the rocks. And I'm going to continue to bring this down through this negative space between this foreground rock. It's not quite as bright, but it's still pretty bright. So I love how this foreground rock really becomes like a silhouette. So notice too, as I bring the white around, I'm actually sort of swallowing up the outline. There's a fairly light area over here. But I really want to prioritize where the brightest brights are. I don't want to put a really bright coat of white on areas that aren't that luminous, because then what would happen is that those areas wouldn't fall into the midtone. So as I come over towards the left, or towards this side here, I'm noticing again, it's a little bit of a gradual progression, but then I also have some of these like little sort of wave, sort of like slightly lighter wave marks I can put in. And then as I come over even further, it gets darker and darker. And so over on this side, I really don't want to put too much pigment down. And then a similar thing happens as I come over here to this side. So you can see with this tone of paper, which is on the dark side, you can actually get a fair amount of tonal rendering done without even adding a dark in here. So you can see how this is starting to happen. And then what's also interesting here in the sky is look at how the sky is very bright. And then it comes down and creates the horizon with the darker water. So it's a bit of a flip-flop. So don't forget that the sky is really important in terms of creating a relationship to the water. And as I come over here, the water's almost the same value as the sky. Almost, you've seen that in nature, you know, when you're out looking at the horizon and it almost gets swallowed by the water. And then over here again, the water's much brighter. So again, it's almost an inverse of what's happening. But this very bright note as the sky meets the water on either end, again, helps the water sort of sit back and have the value it needs. And I'm noticing here that I need to brighten this up a little bit too, just this negative space between the rocks. So this starts to begin to mimic a little bit what's happening in the image, and I haven't added any dark. I've just added light. And I could leave it this way because it starts to sort of create the effect, that luminous effect of the water. I've also starting to see that this is almost like a little zigzag coming down, so I think I'd like to emphasize that a little bit more, this sort of zig and zag of the light, because that helps to create a sense of movement and space. But I do think that I need to bring in a bit of dark, and the darkest darks for me are definitely in the foreground areas, some in the distance too. And this can be a rather subtle effect. These are rocks, so I'm gonna just start laying in just a very subtle dark. I might leave the top of the rocks actually the color of the paper. Let's see what happens. It's the kind of thing you kind of know a little bit more about as you go along. But I do think these definitely need to be knocked back a little bit. And you notice as I start to put in this darker tone. And these rocks are really silhouetted. As I start to do that, the light of the water actually seems to get even brighter because it's all about contrast, it's all about relationship. So you can continue to build this, pushing the darks, highlighting the lights. And in the distance here too, I feel like we need to kind of ground some of these distant rocks. Just kind of create a little bit of a sense of give them a little bit more dominance. So as I develop this, you can see how it starts to resonate with the image, and using this mid-tone paper, highlighting with the light, darkening with the dark, is an incredible way to create luminous images on a mid-tone.